Welcome to part one of output parameters. And we're talking about, of course, output parameters for stored procedures. Now, this is going to be a two-part video because I want to go through this very slowly and methodically with a very simple example so that you can understand and get exactly what's going on here, because output parameters tend to be confusing for people because it seems somewhat manual in the way that you have to set it up. Here's what we're going to do. Very similar to the stored procedure that we used a little earlier in the original working with input parameters or stored procedure parameters, we're going to create a stored procedure using input parameters, but this time we're going to add an output parameter. So I'm going to type create proc, and we'll call this proc ML. That's a nice creative name, right? And I'm going to put right here my input parameter called LName, and it's a varchar 40 is the data type. Put a comma, and I'm going to set a separate parameter, and this one will be an output parameter. And I'm going to call it numRows because we want to capture the number of rows that are affected by this stored procedure. It's an integer data type. We'll default it to 0 by saying equals 0. And now we're going to put the output keyword. This lets SQL Server know that this particular variable is going to be used to output data. Now, output variables are very powerful in stored procedures because think of how we will use stored procedures in the real world. We may have a web application, we may have a desktop application, but something is going to be taking user input, connecting to a database, calling a stored procedure on that database, but we may want the stored procedure to send us back some information so that we can use that to branch or let the user know something in, say, a message box or a status bar readout or something in our application. The stored procedures now become kind of like functions in our C# or C++ or VB.NET programming, and we can have that stored procedure pass us something back that we can use in an external application environment. Hope that makes sense. If not, it will when you actually begin to program one of these up. So I have created my two parameters. LName there is an input, numRows is output. Now I'll put my as keyword, and we will put our query. We're going to select the last name from the person table, and we're going to put a where clause on there where last name is like our variable value, whatever is passed in. But now we're going to go one extra step, and we're going to set the @numRows variable, and that's the one that's going to be passed out, equal to something called @rowCount. I want you to notice @rowCount. Anytime you see two ats, that is a system variable, and there are a number of these. @rowCount is automatically loaded every time a query executes on SQL Server. The number of rows affected by that query get automatically loaded into @rowCount. Now, obviously, this is a very dynamic variable because as soon as another query executes, the number of rows it affects overwrites whatever's in @rowCount. So what we want to do to utilize @rowCount is anytime we execute a query, we can immediately, after that query executes, take the value of @rowCount and load it into our own variable, and then we can capture it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to run this query using our input parameter of @LName. We're going to take whatever it loads into @rowCount as the number of rows affected. We're going to load that into our output parameter that we created right up here. And then when we call this, we're going to access that output parameter and use it. And so there we go. That is our stored procedure. So I will highlight this and execute it. And we have now created our stored procedure. The command completed successfully. So I'll Control-R to make that go away. And I'm going to scroll all of this up for just a moment here, and let's now talk about how we can use this output parameter. Well, we're going to have to declare a variable to catch whatever is coming back from the stored procedure as an output variable. So we're going to call our variable that catches it RETROWS, or return rows, if you will. And it's an integer data type. Now, the data type on the variable that's going to catch it has to match the data type of the output variable that we created in our stored procedure. That just makes sense. The data types must match. And then we're going to execute our stored procedure. Now, in the original video, the first video where I talked about creating stored procedures and calling stored procedures, I didn't mention the word execute. It doesn't technically have to be there. It's not required. However, you need to go ahead and establish a practice of using it. You can spell execute out, or you can just use the first 4 letters, either way. But having execute there in front of it lets us know that we're calling this particular object, this stored procedure. It makes it not ambiguous or unambiguous to us when we're looking at it later. And trust me, you'll be back in here a few months looking at this and you're wondering, wow, what was I on that morning? What kind of sinus medicine had I been taking when I wrote this code? So this makes it easier to read and understand. That also helps the optimizer totally understand what's going on. And so I always want to use execute. Now let's stop part 1 right here. And if you'll join me in part 2, we're going to take up right here and we're going to complete this example of helping you understand how to use output parameters with stored procedures.